A man can be erased from the world so very easily. The year is 1943, and the Pacific Ocean is a hunting ground. A vast blue desert where steel birds spit fire and the waves below swallow secrets whole. In this emptiness, a machine fails. An airplane, a vessel of war, succumbs to the simple, brutal law of gravity. It falls from the sky, and with it, the lives of its crew are torn from the ledger of the living. But from this watery grave, something impossible happens. A life refuses to be extinguished. This is the story of Louis Zamperini, and a testament to the profound, almost unbelievable power of the human will to simply endure. The air over the Pacific was a strange brew of contradictions. It was thick with the humidity of the tropics, yet carried the cold metallic scent of machinery and high-octane fuel. It was a canvas of impossible beauty. Sunrises that bled purple and gold across the horizon, cloud formations that rose like celestial mountains, and yet it was a battlefield, a place of profound and constant danger. Young men, barely out of their teens, crisscrossed this expanse in bombers, great metal beasts named after predators and promises of victory. They were the tip of a spear, a generation sent forth to push back the tide of tyranny. But they were also just boys, far from home, suspended between the indifferent sky and the even more indifferent sea. One of these planes was a B-24 Liberator, nicknamed the Green Hornet, and on a search and rescue mission out of Funafuti, it was a deeply troubled machine. Known as a musher, it was sluggish and difficult to keep level. A plane that pilots whispered about, the kind of aircraft that felt like it was constantly fighting its own wings. On board, the crew was a collection of men bound by duty and the shared, unspoken understanding of their own mortality. Among them was the pilot, Russell Allen Phil Phillips, a quiet, steady man whose heart was tethered to his sweetheart, Cece, back home. And in the bombardier's seat was a young man whose legs had once carried him to the Olympic Games in Berlin, a man who had stared into the eyes of the very architect of the war that now consumed his life. His name was Louis Zamperini. Zamperini was not born for quiet obedience. He was a force of nature from his earliest days in Torrance, California, a whirlwind of restless energy, a delinquent in the making, a boy whose spirit was too large for the world he inhabited. He ran from the police, he brawled, he stole, but a wise older brother saw that this fire was not a flaw, but a fuel. He channeled Louis's untamed spirit into the discipline of track and field, and there, on the cinder track, Louis found a home for his rebellion. He learned to transform pain into speed, to push his body past the screaming protests of his muscles, to find a place of serene focus in the midst of physical agony. This training, this self-inflicted crucible of endurance, would become the bedrock of his survival, in ways he could never possibly imagine. He ran in the 1936 Berlin Olympics, a boy from California competing on the world stage, his every stride a defiance of the rigid, imposing order of the Third Reich. He didn't win a medal in the 5,000-meter race, but his final lap was so astonishingly fast that it caught the attention of Adolf Hitler himself. It was a strange, fleeting intersection of two destinies, a brief moment before the world they knew was set ablaze. Now, years later, that runner was here, thousands of feet above the Pacific, encased in the rattling fuselage of the Green Hornet. The search mission was a grim one, looking for a lost plane, for friends, for any sign of life in the overwhelming emptiness. The ocean stretched out below, a wrinkled sheet of sapphire silk, beautiful and terrifying. From this height, it seemed peaceful, but the men who flew over it knew better. They knew of its sudden squalls, its crushing depths, and the creatures that patrolled its waters. They knew it was a place that offered no second chances. The moment of failure was not dramatic, not a cinematic explosion. It was something far more insidious, a mechanical groan, A shudder that ran through the plane's metal skeleton. An engine sputtered, caught, and then died. Then another. The calm voice of Phil Phillips over the intercom, fighting to keep the tremor from his words. The plane, already a difficult beast to control, began its long, graceless fall. Inside it was a chaos of noise and motion, the roar of the wind, the shriek of tearing metal, the desperate shouts of men bracing for an impact they knew was unsurvivable. The world became a tumbling, incoherent nightmare. For Zamperini, the runner's instinct kicked in. The instinct to brace, to control what little he could, to prepare his body for a shock it was never designed to withstand. He was thrown violently, tangled in the wires and guts of the dying machine. And then there was only darkness, pressure, and the suffocating rush of cold, salty water. The silence that followed the chaos was the most terrifying sound of all. It was the silence of the deep, a heavy, pressing quiet that signified the end. But for Louis Zamperini, it was not the end. Consciousness returned as a desperate, burning need for air. He was trapped, tangled in the wreckage, his life measured in the seconds his lungs could hold out. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claim him. But then something else took over. The discipline of the track. The voice of his brother Pete telling him, "A moment of pain is worth a lifetime of glory." He fought, not with wild, thrashing panic, but with a focused, desperate determination. He untangled himself, his fingers finding their way in the darkness, and pushed himself out of the sinking tomb of the Green Hornet. He broke the surface, gasping, his lungs screaming in relief. The sky was still there. The sun was still bright. But the world had been violently, irrevocably remade. The B-24 was gone, leaving only a slick of oil and a scattering of debris on the surface, a fleeting tombstone that the ocean was already erasing. He was alone, utterly, completely alone in the largest, deepest body of water on the planet. The shock gave way to a primal, piercing fear. Was this it? Was this the end? He shouted the names of his crewmates, his voice swallowed by the immense silence. And then a sound, a voice. It was Phil, the pilot, his head bleeding but his spirit intact. And then another, the tail gunner, Francis McNamara, known as Mac. 3 of them, out of a crew of 11, 3 had survived the unsurvivable. They found 2 small inflatable life rafts, remnants of the plane's emergency supplies, and clung to them as if they were the last solid things on Earth. They were alive, but as they huddled together, shivering, watching the last traces of their plane disappear, a new and more daunting reality began to settle in. They had survived the fall. Now, they had to survive the ocean. Surviving a fall from the sky is a matter of luck and brutal physics. Surviving the ocean is an art, a science, and a war waged within the mind. The first days were a blur of shock, disbelief, and a dawning, horrifying understanding of their predicament. The rafts, small yellow rectangles of inflated rubber, were their entire world. They were flimsy, fragile, and offered almost no protection from the elements. The supplies they had salvaged were pitifully meager. A few half-pint tins of water, some squares of military-grade chocolate, a flare gun, and a few other small tools. It was a laughable arsenal against the Titan they now faced. The sun became their first great enemy. It was not the gentle, warming sun of a California beach. It was a merciless, white-hot disk that beat down from a cloudless sky, day after day. It cooked the surface of the rafts until they were too hot to touch. It reflected off the water with a blinding intensity, forcing the men to squint until their eyes ached and their vision blurred. There was no shade, no escape. The heat drew the moisture from their bodies, leaving their lips cracked, their tongues swollen, and their minds swimming in a fog of dehydration. The salt from the sea spray caked their skin, creating a crust that chafed and burned, opening sores that wept and refused to heal in the damp, corrosive environment. At night, the sun would vanish, and the temperature would plummet. The cold was a different kind of torture, a deep, penetrating chill that made their teeth chatter and their bodies tremble uncontrollably. They would huddle together for warmth, the thin rubber of the raft the only thing separating them from the black, frigid depths. The stories you've heard about human resilience often focus on a single, heroic act. But the truth of survival is far more granular, more intimate. It's found in the small victories, the quiet acts of ingenuity that keep hope alive for one more day. If these men were to survive, they would need more than just their will. They would need to learn the brutal language of their new world. It is a testament to the power of the human spirit that we can find stories of courage not just on the battlefield, but in the quiet, desperate struggles for existence. If you find inspiration in these accounts of ingenuity and perseverance, consider subscribing to our channel. You will be joining a community that honors the depth of human strength and ensuring these vital stories are not forgotten. Hunger and thirst became the central, organizing principles of their existence. The emergency rations were gone in a matter of days. Mac, in a moment of panicked desperation, had eaten all the chocolate in a single night. It was an act born of terror, not malice, but its consequences were dire. Lewis and Phil understood. There was no room for blame on the raft. There was only the shared reality of their impending starvation. Thirst was the more immediate and vicious tormentor. It was a physical pain, a scraping in the throat, a headache that pounded behind the eyes. It brought on hallucinations, mirages of islands and ships shimmering on the horizon, cruel tricks played by a desperate mind. They prayed for rain, and when it finally came, it was a moment of pure, unadulterated ecstasy. They tilted their heads back, mouths open, letting the fresh, cool water wash over their parched tongues. They used a small piece of canvas to try and collect every precious drop. A frantic, clumsy effort that yielded a pitifully small, yet life-giving amount of water. Food was a far greater challenge. The ocean teemed with life, but it was just beyond their reach. A tantalizing feast they could see but not touch. Sharks, a constant, menacing presence, began to circle the rafts. Their dorsal fins would slice through the water, sometimes for hours on end, a silent, patient reminder of the food chain they were now at the bottom of. The men could feel their dark, heavy bodies bumping against the thin rubber floor of the raft, a terrifying, visceral connection to the predators below. They were being watched, studied, waited for. Yet, paradoxically, the creatures of the sea also offered their only hope. An albatross, weary from its long flight, landed on the raft. In any other context, it would have been a moment of natural beauty. Here, it was a miracle of protein. Lewis, with the lightning reflexes of an athlete, snatched the bird. Its capture was a grim, necessary act of violence. They wrung its neck, and in a moment that stripped away every veneer of civilization, they tore into the raw flesh. It was tough, oily, and tasted of fish, but it was sustenance. It was life. They used the bird's entrails as bait on a small hook they fashioned, and managed to catch a few small fish. Each catch was a monumental victory, a temporary reprieve from the gnawing emptiness in their stomachs. As the days bled into weeks, the physical toll was immense. Their bodies began to waste away. They became skeletal, their skin stretched tight over their ribs, their muscles atrophied, the sores on their skin festered. Their hair was bleached white by the sun, their faces burned and peeling. They were withering, becoming ghosts of their former selves. But as their bodies weakened, something extraordinary was happening within their minds. They had to keep their minds sharp to fight off the lethargy and despair that could kill them as surely as starvation. Lewis, drawing on his boisterous, storytelling nature, became the raft's cruise director. He would describe, in painstaking, mouth-watering detail, the meals his mother used to cook. He would conjure the image of her spaghetti sauce, the smell of her baking bread, the texture of her ravioli. They would spend hours on these culinary fantasies, their minds feasting while their bodies starved. It was more than just a distraction. It was an act of rebellion, a refusal to let their spirits be consumed by the emptiness that surrounded them. They held onto the memories of home, of love, of a world beyond the endless blue, as if those memories were rations for the soul. The psychological warfare was relentless. The vast, featureless expanse of the ocean worked on the mind, eroding the sense of time and purpose. Was it Tuesday? Was it Friday? Had they been adrift for 10 days or 20? The sun and moon were their only clocks, the rhythm of the waves their only calendar. Hallucinations became more frequent. They would hear choirs singing, see land where there was none. They had to constantly check in with one another to anchor themselves in a shared reality. However grim that reality was, their bond, forged in the terror of the crash, now deepened into a form of codependence that was essential for their survival. Phil, the quiet engineer, was the steady hand, the calm presence. Lewis was the engine, the defiant optimist, the one who refused to let them surrender to the silence. And Mac, haunted by his initial panic, was fading. He grew quiet, withdrawn, the light in his eyes dimming with each passing day. Lewis and Phil did their best to keep him engaged, to share their meager rations of fish and water with him, to talk to him. But he was slipping away, lost to a despair that was as deep as the ocean itself. Then, in the midst of this slow-motion struggle, the war found them again. A speck appeared on the horizon, growing steadily larger. It was a plane. Hope, electrifying and overwhelming, surged through them. They fired their flare gun, a desperate plea painting a streak of red against the blue sky. The plane banked, turning towards them. They were seen. They were saved. Their ordeal was over. But as the plane drew closer, the joy curdled into ice-cold terror. On its wings, they saw the symbol of the rising sun. It was a Japanese bomber. The plane circled once, then twice, its crew clearly visible, staring down at the three emaciated figures on the raft. There was no wave of acknowledgement, no sign of rescue. The bomber aligned itself for a strafing run. The water around the raft erupted in geysers as bullets stitched a line across the ocean's surface. The men threw themselves into the water, diving deep to avoid the deadly barrage. The irony was savage. To escape death from the sky, they had to seek refuge in the shark-infested water that had been their greatest fear. They clung to the underside of the raft, their hearts pounding with a primal terror. As the bomber made pass after pass, trying to kill the men it could not be bothered to rescue. The bullets tore through the raft, puncturing one of its two air chambers. When the plane finally flew away, leaving them in a profound, ringing silence, they clambered back aboard their crippled home. They were alive, but their sanctuary was dying. The hissing sound of air escaping the pontoon was the sound of their hope deflating. The attack left them with a new, urgent task. They had to save their world. The raft, their flimsy protector, was wounded and sinking. Using the small patch kit, they began the painstaking work of repairing the bullet holes. Their fingers, clumsy and weak from malnutrition, struggled with the small pieces of vulcanizing rubber and cement. The sharks, drawn by the commotion, returned, their dark shapes circling with a renewed, menacing interest. It was a race against time, a desperate battle of ingenuity against overwhelming odds. Pumping the small bellows to re-inflate the chamber took hours of grueling, exhausting effort. But they did it. They patched the holes, they pumped the air, they saved their raft. It was a victory, but a hollow one. The attack had shattered their last illusion, that the world of men, the war they were a part of, might somehow save them. They were utterly on their own. It is in these moments, when all external hope is extinguished, that the true measure of a person is taken. Faced with the stark reality of their isolation, some would surrender. But for others, it becomes a crucible that forges an unbreakable will. The story of Louis Zamperini and Phil Phillips is a profound reminder that the most powerful resource we have in any crisis is the spirit within. This channel is dedicated to exploring that spirit, to telling the stories of those who faced the impossible and refused to break.
By sharing these narratives, we not only honor their memory, but we also uncover the timeless lessons of human endurance.
If you believe these stories matter, if they move you to reflect on your own capacity for strength, then we ask you to join our community. Your subscription is a statement that courage and ingenuity deserve to be celebrated and remembered. The days that followed the bomber attack were a turning point. The initial shock of their predicament had worn off, replaced by a grim, hardened resolve. But they also lost a man. Mac, who had never fully recovered from the psychological blow of the crash and the guilt of eating the chocolate, succumbed to the relentless deprivation. He died quietly in the night. In the vast loneliness of the Pacific, they held a small, makeshift burial at sea. They spoke a few words, a prayer for their fallen comrade, and with heavy hearts, they gently slid his body into the water. The loss was profound. The raft felt emptier, the silence heavier. Now they were two men against an ocean, their shared grief another bond between them. The passing of Mac seemed to galvanize Louis and Phil. They knew they were living on a knife's edge, that the slightest lapse in discipline or hope could send them following their friend into the depths. They became even more meticulous in their routines. They talked constantly, not just of food, but of their families, their dreams, their futures. Phil spoke of Cece, his love for her, a lighthouse guiding his spirit through the fog of despair. Louis spoke of his family, of the roar of the Olympic crowd, of the simple pleasure of running on a cool California morning. They were keeping each other's worlds alive. Then came the storm. It approached not as a sudden squall, but as a slow, ominous darkening of the horizon. The sky turned a bruised purple-gray. The sea, which had been their flat, indifferent companion, began to heave and swell. The waves grew into monstrous, rolling mountains of water. Their tiny raft was lifted to the crest of these waves, held there for a terrifying moment as they stared down into a deep, churning trough before being sent careening down the other side. The wind howled, a physical force that threatened to rip them from their hold. Rain came down in blinding sheets, cold and punishing. For hours, they fought to keep the raft from capsizing, bailing water with their hands, their bodies screaming with effort. In the heart of this maelstrom, hanging onto the ropes of the raft as a 40-foot wave crested over them, Louis Zamperini faced a moment of reckoning. He was not a particularly religious man, but in that moment, staring into the abyss, he made a pact. He prayed. He shouted into the wind, "God, if you get me through this, I'll serve you for the rest of my life." It was the prayer of a desperate man, a bargain made with a power he could not see, but could feel in the awesome, terrifying force of the storm. The storm eventually passed, as all storms do, and in the calm that followed, in the eerie, exhausted silence, the two men were still there, battered, bruised, but alive. The raft had held. They had held. Something had shifted in Louis. The promise he had made in the heart of the storm had planted a seed. He had been tested by a power far greater than himself, and had survived. The ordeal continued. The days stretched into a month, then beyond. They had now been adrift longer than any known survivor in history. They were living skeletons, their bodies a roadmap of suffering. Yet their minds remained sharp. The daily rituals, the storytelling, the shared hope. These were the things that kept them human. They had learned the rhythms of the ocean, the habits of its creatures. They had become a part of this world that was trying to kill them. They were no longer just soldiers or airmen. They were survivors, men who had been stripped of everything but the raw, unyielding core of their will to live. On the 46th day, Louis saw something. It wasn't a mirage. It had substance. It was the deep, rich green of vegetation. It was land. At first, Phil didn't believe him, his mind too wary of the ocean's cruel tricks. But it was real. An island. Hope, a feeling they had almost forgotten, returned with the force of a tidal wave. With the last of their strength, they began to paddle with their hands, a final desperate push towards salvation. The current was against them, a final cruel joke played by the ocean. It was trying to pull them away, back into the open sea. They paddled until their arms were numb, until their vision blurred, their bodies screaming in protest. They were so close. As they neared the island, a boat appeared, heading towards them. Figures stood on its deck. They were being rescued. After 47 days, after drifting over 2,000 miles, after facing starvation, dehydration, sharks, and an enemy bomber, their ordeal was over. They had done it. They had survived the ocean. But as the boat drew near, they saw the uniforms of the men on board. They saw the flag it was flying. It was the same rising sun they had seen on the wings of the bomber. Their rescuers were the Japanese Navy. They had survived the vast, impersonal cruelty of nature only to fall into the calculated, personal cruelty of man. Their journey into the abyss was not over. It was just beginning. The 47 days on the raft were a crucible that forged Louis Zamperini into a man of almost unbreakable will. The suffering he endured at sea did not destroy him. It stripped him down to his essential self and showed him a strength he never knew he possessed. This strength would be tested in the brutal Japanese prisoner of war camps, where he would face torments designed to break the body and, more importantly, the spirit. But the man who had survived the Pacific was not so easily broken. The lessons of the raft, the discipline, the ingenuity, the power of hope, the promise he had made to God in the storm, became his armor. He had learned that the human body could endure almost anything as long as the mind refused to surrender. When we look back at history, we see the grand sweep of armies and nations, of ideologies and empires. But history is also written in the quiet, intimate struggles of individuals. It is written on a rubber raft in the middle of the Pacific, in the hearts of men who refused to be erased. The story of Louis Zamperini and Russell Allen Phillips is not just a story of survival. It is a profound exploration of the limits of human endurance and the boundless capacity of the human spirit. It reminds us that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, a single, determined life can hold on to the light. It teaches us that resilience is not the absence of suffering, but the ability to find meaning and purpose within it. The ocean that tried to claim him, instead, became the silent witness to a will that would not be broken. The echoes of such stories are a vital part of our shared human heritage. They are the narratives that remind us of who we can be in our most difficult moments. To keep these echoes alive, to ensure that the lessons of sacrifice, faith, and ingenuity are passed on, is a responsibility we all share. If this journey through the past has moved you, please consider sharing it with others, so that the legacy of these ordinary men who achieved the extraordinary may continue to inspire. Thank you for listening.